On the first day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, no bombs fell on London, Berlin, or New York. No missiles reached Paris. No troops crossed any NATO border. The conflict was geographically contained, thousands of miles from most of the people who would ultimately pay for it. But within 72 hours, something happened in the global economy that touched every single person on Earth regardless of where they lived. Energy prices spiked. Wheat futures exploded. Supply chains that were already fragile from 2 years of pandemic disruption snapped under the additional pressure. Inflation, already elevated, accelerated into territory not seen in 40 years across Europe and North America. People who had never heard of Mariupol were paying more for bread. People who couldn't find Ukraine on a map were paying more to heat their homes. The war was over there. The financial consequences were everywhere. Now imagine that conflict wasn't regional. Imagine the world's two largest economies, the United States and China, moved from competition to confrontation. Imagine the financial system, the supply chains, the energy markets, and the trade architecture that the entire global economy runs on suddenly became a battlefield. You would not need to be anywhere near the fighting to lose everything you saved. This is not a hypothetical designed to frighten you. It is a documented pattern with a century of evidence behind it. And understanding exactly how it works, the specific mechanisms through which modern conflict destroys civilian savings, is the most important financial education nobody is giving you right now. Start with the mechanism that moves fastest: inflation. War is the most inflationary event a modern economy can experience. Not gradually, not manageably, catastrophically, and immediately. Here is why. Modern warfare requires enormous quantities of energy, metals, food, and manufactured goods. Governments at war redirect industrial capacity toward military production. Supply of consumer goods falls. Government spending explodes, funded by debt, by money creation, or by both simultaneously. The amount of money in circulation increases, while the amount of things to buy with it decreases. The result is textbook inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods, but at a speed and scale that peacetime policy tools were not designed to manage. During World War I, prices in the United States roughly doubled in 4 years. During World War II, aggressive price controls suppressed official inflation, but shortages, rationing, and black market pricing told the real story of purchasing power erosion. In countries closer to the actual fighting, the numbers were catastrophic. German hyperinflation in the early 1920s, a direct consequence of war debt and reparations, saw prices doubling every few days at its peak. People carried currency in wheelbarrows. Lifetime savings became worthless between morning and afternoon. That was a century ago, with a far less interconnected global economy. In 2026, with supply chains spanning every continent, with financial markets linked in real time, with energy systems interdependent across adversarial borders, the transmission speed of wartime economic shock would be faster than anything previously experienced. The second mechanism is currency destruction, and this one is silent until it isn't. When governments face the extraordinary expense of war, they have three options: tax their populations, borrow from international markets, or print money. Taxation at wartime scale is politically difficult and economically slow. International borrowing becomes unreliable when the world is divided into adversarial blocks. Printing money is fast, controllable, and the political cost is deferred, because inflation arrives months after the money creation, by which time the immediate crisis justifies the long-term pain. Every major power in every major 20th century conflict printed money. Every one of them experienced significant currency devaluation as a consequence. For the ordinary person, currency devaluation is not an abstract financial concept. It is the specific personal experience of watching the number in your bank account stay the same while the number of things it buys falls continuously. Your savings didn't go anywhere. They were simply made worth less, quietly, legally, and without a single line item on any statement explaining what happened. The third mechanism is the one that financial advisors rarely discuss because it is the most psychologically uncomfortable: market collapse and asset freezing. In the opening days of a serious geopolitical confrontation between major powers, financial markets do not fall in an orderly, correctable way. They seize. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Moscow Stock Exchange suspended trading entirely for several weeks. Russian citizens with brokerage accounts could not sell, could not access, could not protect. Their assets were frozen in place, while the value of everything around those assets shifted dramatically. Western investors in Russian securities, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, individual investors found their holdings sanctioned, frozen, or rendered effectively worthless regardless of the underlying asset quality. In a conflict involving the United States and China, the two largest holders of each other's financial assets, assets on Earth, the mutual financial destruction would operate at a scale that dwarfs anything the Russia situation produced. American pension funds hold Chinese assets. Chinese sovereign wealth funds hold American treasury bonds. The financial entanglement between these two economies is so deep that separating them under conflict conditions would not be a clean cut. It would be a rupture, with collateral damage spreading to every market, every currency, and every retirement account connected to either system, which, in 2026, means virtually every retirement account on Earth. Here is the geography of who gets hurt first, and it is not who most people assume. The instinct is to think that proximity to conflict determines financial exposure, that people far from the fighting are financially safe. The evidence says otherwise. In the modern globalized economy, the most financially exposed populations are frequently those in smaller, trade-dependent economies with limited foreign currency reserves and high dependence on imported energy and food. Pakistan, Egypt, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Bangladesh. These are not countries that start wars. They are countries that absorb the financial consequences of wars they had no role in causing, through rising import costs, collapsing currencies, and the sudden withdrawal of the international credit that keeps their economies functional. Sri Lanka's 2022 economic collapse, which produced empty fuel stations, 18-hour power cuts, and a government default, was not caused by a war. It was caused by the global commodity shock that followed one. A genuine major power confrontation would produce a commodity shock many times larger. The countries least equipped to absorb it would feel it first. Their populations, already operating without financial margin, would experience savings destruction not over months but over weeks. Here is the final layer, the one closest to home for anyone watching this in a developed economy and thinking this is someone else's problem. The 2008 financial crisis began in American mortgage markets and reached every corner of the global economy within months. The 2020 pandemic began in one city and disrupted supply chains on every continent within weeks. Financial contagion travels at the speed of information. In a world where every market is connected to every other market in real time, the idea that a major geopolitical conflict between superpowers would leave any economy, however large, however developed, however geographically distant, financially unaffected, is not a reasonable assumption. It is a comfortable story people tell themselves because the alternative requires thinking about things that are deeply unpleasant to think about. Here is the thought that this leaves open, and it doesn't resolve cleanly. Every previous generation that lived through a major war understood, viscerally and immediately, that conflict had a financial cost borne by civilians. They experienced it in ration books, in currency reforms, in savings bonds that matured into depreciated currency, in bank runs and frozen accounts, and the slow realization that a number in the passbook no longer corresponded to anything real. The current generation, in wealthy countries especially, has lived through several decades of relative peace and has largely forgotten that lesson. The financial system feels permanent. The stability feels structural. But stability is not a law of physics. It is a condition, and conditions change. The question is not whether you have thought about what happens to your savings if that condition changes. The question is whether you have thought about it early enough to matter. If this reframed something you assumed was someone else's problem, share it with someone who hasn't made that connection yet. And if you want to understand the other global forces that are quietly moving toward your financial life right now, the next video is already waiting for you.